morning. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Chair. This morning we'll hear from John Collier.
Thank you.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm,
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Mr. Collier, please could you give your full name?
Jonathan Stephen Collier.
And is it correct that you have provided 3 reports to this inquiry? The first with reference INQ 000111, which is dated the 17th of January 2022.
Yes.
And the second, which has a URN of INQ 000158, which is your supplementary report dated the 3rd of March of this year.
Yes.
And the third, which is your second supplementary report with INQ 000177 as a reference dated the 17th of March 2022.
Yes.
Chair, may they be adduced into evidence?
Thank you indeed.
I want to just summarise first your 3 reports in terms of what you were asked to consider and what you did consider. In the first report, it's 189 pages. That is your main report, where you've reviewed 43 incidents and assessed them against the required standards on use of force. You have come to various conclusions, which can be broken down into themes, and then have put forward recommendations based on those themes. Is that correct?
Yes, and findings and recommendations at the end, yes.
And the second report, your first supplementary report, that's 100 pages, and that answers questions of clarification, questions that were based on new evidence, both live evidence from both phases of the inquiry, phase 1 and 2, and detailed questions from core participants.
Yes.
And then finally, the third report, the second supplementary report, was a shorter report, 17 pages, where you consider additional footage that was provided by G4S relating to use of force incidents which you'd already considered, and for which, in the case of 4 incidents, you changed your mind about in terms of whether they were of concern or not.
That's correct.
I want to first ask you about your current role and your qualifications. In your first report, at Appendix 1, you set out that you are currently the Operational Practice Delivery Manager within the National Incident Management Unit of HM Prison and Probation Service. Can you just briefly explain what that means day to day?
Well, that has sort of many facets to it. Part of it is to provide subject matter expert opinions on either criminal investigations for police CPS, coroner's inquests and internal disciplinary hearings. It's also to look at the actual practice out in establishments to ensure good governance, to ensure that practice replicates what's in policy, what's in training, and that establishments have got assurance on their management and oversight of use of force.
You've got 27 years of experience in use of force training, operational management of use of force, investigations into use of force, and providing expert reports for litigation. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And in terms of your experience as a use and force instructor, that's you have been the national lead for training, delivery and development.
Yes.
In terms of operational manager, you've responded to serious incidents. I assume live, is that right?
Yes, serious acts that required national support above what they could manage locally, yes.
And you have acted as the National Tactical Response Group's litigation subject matter expert on your use of force incidents. And you also have previous experience assisting with external agency investigations. Could you give us an example of one of those external agency investigations and what you mean by that?
That's for agencies that are approved users of the use of force curriculum developed by HMPPS. So that could be the Home Office or partner agencies such as secure training centres and other areas like that that use curriculum involving use of force that has been approved by the prison service.
And in terms of expert reports for litigation, are you able to give an example of when you've given an expert opinion on use of force?
For a lot of times on litigation, it's more to do with civil claims. So it's whether an injury to either a prisoner or to a member of staff through either a live incident or from a in staff's circumstances through a training incident. So it's to provide reports to make sure that everything was done correctly, that the safe systems had worked, the risk assessments had been followed correctly, and to also take away learning from it to avoid repeat similar incidents.
Your expertise is based in the prison service as opposed to IRCs, immigration removal centres in particular. But is the same manual and training used in relation to IRCs as to prisons?
It is, yes.
You've visited Brook House, haven't you, in the course of this inquiry?
Yes.
And you've watched some evidence from the inquiry and read transcripts?
Yes.
Which parts of the evidence have you watched?
The footage.
Yeah, in terms of the inquiry hearings.
Yep. The incidents that.
Sorry for not being clear.
Yeah.
Rather than the footage of the use of force instance itself, have you watched any footage of the inquiry itself?
Oh, sorry.
Other witnesses giving
yes,
evidence?
Yes, I have. Yes. Yeah.
And which witnesses have you watched?
Some of the DCMs, DCM Webb, DCM Dix, Povey Meyer, Mr. Petherick, Ben Saunders, some of the medical experts, I can't recall their names. So it's literally watched sort of intermittently during my day job, yes.
And you've read transcripts of, I think, almost all of the DCMs and the DCOs who have given evidence.
Yes.
And certainly ones who have been involved in the use of force instance, which you've reviewed. And before writing your reports to this inquiry, you had some familiarity with the inquiry subject matter, given the fact that you provided 3 reports to Sussex Police in February 2018 concerning the incident shown in Panorama, which has been referred to in this inquiry by some as the chokehold by Jan Pascali on D1 527. That's something we're going to come to later this morning. I want to ask you now about the methodology that you used to draft these reports. You've, in your first report, pages 4 and 5, there's no need to turn to it unless you need to. At paragraph 4, you list 10 categories of documents which you were provided with by the inquiry. They included Home Office PSU investigation reports, G4S use of force reports, and by that we mean the witness statements that were provided by each officer, G4S policy and procedure documents, management reports, training documents and risk assessments, walk-through video and plans of the physical environment of Brook House, IMB logs and reports, Gatwick ILC meeting minutes and policies, and then detainee records and complaints. In terms of footage, you are provided with the broadcast and unbroadcast BBC footage, the CCTV, body-worn camera footage and footage from handheld devices. And in relation to each of those incidents, you reviewed all of those categories of relevant documentation which the inquiry has. Is that right?
Yes.
In terms of your instructions, which you set out at paragraph 5 of your first report, you were asked to provide your opinion on the background of the use of force, which we'll come on to, the standards to be expected, training, and in particular on whether each individual instance of use of force was reasonable, necessary, no more than necessary, that no more force than was necessary was used, and whether it was proportionate or not. You were also asked to whether the incidents were recorded properly, whether they were use of force in general subject to rigorous governance and oversight, and also to examine if there are any particular considerations when using force against vulnerable detained persons. You've reviewed 43 incidents, and of that 43 originally, there were 22 of concern. And is it right that they are in the first part of your report?
I identified those in the first report, yes.
You stated that a large percentage of those incidents were justified on the basis of failure to comply with removal orders or move to CSU for good order and discipline.
Yes.
But there are also other incidents that were to prevent self-harm, using personal safety, following a fight, preventing assault and so on. How different is that from the prison environment in terms of the reasons used for force? Obviously, there isn't a failure to comply with a removal order, but say good order and discipline, maybe.
Well, I think there is something very similar to a removal order. Quite often in a prison environment, you'll have people that refuse to go to court, for instance. So if a judge has ordered a production of someone in court and they refuse to go, so I'd say that's probably the closest link between the two. So in them circumstances, very much the same as with the removal orders for detained persons, it would be that once all reasonable efforts had been made, if there was no other option left, then force would be used to carry out that lawful instruction from either a judge or a removal order.
And in terms of percentages, or perhaps you can't give a specific percentage, but in terms of the proportion of use of force incidents where the reasons are given, is it about the same, would you say, in a prison than it is, in your experience, than it has been in?
It's very hard to judge. Different prisons serve different sort of models. They have different sort of focus, so it will very much differ. More than likely, it would be a local prison where the instance of removal to court, because that's where people on remand are held. So that's the ones where more court appearances would be required. So it's very difficult to work out an estimate there.
I want to move on to the legal and policy framework which you applied when looking at those 43 incidents. In fact, before we do, of those 43 incidents, you found 22 of concern. But now that you found in your third report, having looked at the footage, with those 4 incidents, which related to we'll come on to them during the course of your evidence, but with those 4 incidents which were relating to the concern that force wasn't used as a last resort, would they now be counted as one of those areas of these incidents of concern?
Yes, they would. Yes.
So that makes 26 of the 43 incidents which you saw, so just over half.
Yes.
So moving on then, as I said, to the legal and policy framework to be applied, your report is based on the framework of techniques and requirements of the HMPPS model,
Yes.
which is then associated with the 2015 training manual. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And the manual is a very lengthy document, 328 pages, and that sets out the theory, physical techniques, roles and responsibilities for planned removals versus unplanned use of force, and specifics about specific techniques that are used, such as relocation, personal safety techniques, and so on. Is it right that that document doesn't cover every eventuality?
No, it gives a basis of techniques that staff can use. It sets out the policy, so it reflects the prison service order that was in force at the time, which is PSO 1600, and the amendment, which was PSI 30 of 2015. So it reflects the policy. The techniques are designed to be adaptable to many different situations. It's impossible to put a training manual together that will cover every eventuality that a prison officer, detention centre officer would face in the course of their duty.
And so therefore you have to rely on officers to use their training and experience to respond to specific incidents.
Yes, you expect officers, when they respond to incidents, will have to deal with either confrontation or difficult situations, to adapt those skills and apply them as per the training manual.
The basic principles, which we've already touched upon, are set out in the use of force training manual. It's N0M0001, page 22. Not necessary to look at it now, but essentially they are: is force necessary? Is it reasonable in the circumstances? Is it proportionate in the circumstances? And is no more force used than necessary. And those seem to be the cornerstone of every incident which you judge against.
Yes.
Those are the principles to judge it against.
Yeah, and that's the criteria that I would use for any incident, regardless of whether it was a coroner's inquest, whether it was an inquiry like this or an internal investigation.
You've drafted in your first report, paragraphs 8 and 9, that there is a distinction between force used as self-defence, which is obviously can be deemed as necessary, and force used because and you say prisoner has refused to obey a lawful order. You say it's important to look at the harm that staff are trying to present, so risk to life and limb, property, and good order of the establishment. Although you've referred to prisoner there, is it applicable to a detained person in an ILC as well?
Yeah, that's a direct quote from PSO 1600 and the Use of Force Training Manual, which makes every reference to a prisoner. But as it's the system that's been adopted by the Home Office, then it would apply to a detained person as well, yes.
And so does a lawful order, so the refusal to obey a lawful order, does that also include a lawful order to be removed from the country?
It could do, yeah.
Or to CSU?
Yes.
And that is, as you said, that makes up the majority of the use of force incidents.
Of the ones that I reviewed, yes.
Of the ones you've reviewed, yes. I should say from there that there were 109 use of force incidents which the inquiry had documentation for, and so that's just under half of the incidents which were provided to you.
Okay.
And then looking at the detention centre rules, Rule 41, which you quote at paragraph 7 of your first report, it says, use of force 1, DCOs dealing with a detained person shall not use force unnecessarily, and when the application of force to a detained person is necessary, no more force than is necessary shall be used. Essentially, what reflected in what we've already said in the training manual. And secondly, no officer shall act deliberately in a manner calculated to provoke a detained person. We'll come on to one of the incidents in which that unfortunately was not followed in a moment. Then at page 10, paragraph 18, you quote from PSO 1600, which we've already mentioned. And just for the inquiry's purposes, that is a policy document for the use of force and is applicable within the immigration centres as part of agreed protocols for agencies being authorised to use that curriculum. Is that right?
Yes.
So the role of supervisor section, there is a section there which says that PPE, when using force, is optional, but should only be worn where necessary. And we're going to come on to that as a topic later on. And then we have the Prisoners Service Instruction 04/2017, which came in force on the 20th of March 2017. So that was just before the relevant period. And that was in relation to, and you quote in your report, the section paragraph 2.8 in relation to body-worn cameras.
Yes.
And that again is something that we will come back to. Essentially, what we see there is that it must be used where there has or may be required, where an officer has or may be required to exercise force, where he or she believes that interaction presents or is likely to present a risk to themselves or others when responding to an alarm or incident, and where necessary and proportionate.
Yes.
I want to move on now to the main body of your evidence, which is in relation to your key findings and recommendations. What I'd like to do, Mr. Collier, is go through 7 of the main themes which come out in your report, then use illustrative examples of those, going through in differing detail various incidents which you've highlighted in your report, and look at some footage. And then look at the recommendations that you've provided which relate to that theme, and see if, from the evidence that we have so far, whether it's possible to say if that recommendation has been met or not. The 7 themes which I've taken from your report and from your conclusions, which we'll go through, are firstly an incident which is now infamous within this inquiry, which is the D1527 incident with Jan Pascali. I alluded to it earlier in terms of the detention centre rule 41 perhaps being breached, or you have said in your report that it has in terms of provoking a detained person. The second will be about staff incompetence. The third will be the use of force on naked detainees, which seems to be a specific problem within Brook House. The fourth is lack of de-escalation techniques, in particular the use of PPE, and whether it could have been removed earlier. The fifth is force being used not as a last resort. The sixth is the use of force being used against unwell detainees who offered no threat, including mentally unwell, and we'll touch upon whether the current model is sufficient within that topic. And then finally, monitoring and oversight and criticisms you make in that respect. Before I do that, I want to perhaps start on a positive note, if we can, in terms of best practice. Because there were some themes that you thought were good, having reviewed those incidents. You've put in your first report, at paragraph 664, you say that there was a particular theme of best practice, which was staff remaining focused when subject to abuse. So not responding, not being provoked.
Yeah.
And I want to just briefly look at one particular incident, which is, you say in your report there are two incidents where this is particularly obvious, and those incidents 13317 and 13517. And we can go to we'll just go to one of those, which is 13317, and it's D1978. It's in your report, if John, Mr. Collier, if you want to have a look. It's INQ 000111, page 92 rather. I'm just going to read out your conclusions here and ask you some questions about them. At paragraph 372, which is on page 92, you summarise the incident as follows. You say that the detained person had made threats to staff earlier in the day, and it was decided that he be moved to CSU under Detention Centre Rule 40. He had spat at a DCO and pushed another detainee down a flight of stairs during the day. And moving to paragraph 374, DCM Dix attempted to resolve the incident at the room door, but was met with a negative response. The team were deployed using PPE, including a shield, and restrained the detained person in the room before escorting him to CSU. En route, he continued with verbal abuse, and after being allowed to stand upright, he spat at DCM Dix. He made racist comments towards a member of healthcare and continued threats to staff. And you say at page 96, paragraph 392, the detained person was a challenging individual who constantly made threats towards staff and used racist and insulting foul language. Staff did not react and continued in silence. Did you see that as a general theme within looking at those 43 incidents, staff remaining calm when being provoked?
I think that was the reason I highlighted it on that particular incident, because there was also some footage from earlier in the day made available where the behaviours of the detained person would raise concerns. And I think it was because of the level of abuse and the threats being made, the fact he was spitting at staff. I think it was, it was good practice and certainly evidence real good self-control by the staff that they just carried on with their duty and carried on with the restraint using what was reasonable at the time.
There are other elements of that use of force incident which you have said are concerning, and we'll come on to those under force being not as last resort. But this is the only area in which you've described best practice? Were there other elements of best practice scattered throughout the incidents that you saw?
There were, and a lot of the times what was good practice on one would be poor practice on another incident. So they almost mirrored each other, but they were managed or dealt with differently. Levels of interaction by the DCM in charge. There was one particular incident where the DCM was exemplary, really, in how he managed the situation, how he calmed it down, his interaction with the detained person. But on others, there was I'd say negative, but very little interaction, which little interaction is probably negative, isn't it? It doesn't help the situation. It's not what the supervisory role is about. So I think there's good practice and bad practice evidence in very similar situations.
I want to now move to the areas of concern, and firstly, with the incident with D1527 on the 25th of April. That's the most serious incident which you reviewed and which we've seen on Panorama, and has been called by many, as I said, as the chokehold incident. If we can please turn first, Zainab, to CPS 00002, which is the report to Sussex Police that Mr. Collier, you drafted. It's dated the 6th of February 2018. If we can go to page 3, please. Paragraph 10. You stated here that you were asked specifically by Sussex Police to consider video footage which was provided from the undercover reporting from Callum Tully. You describe Jan Pasquale stating to colleagues that he would put him to fucking sleep, controlling D1527's head, D1527 being in the supine position on his back. You describe Mr. Pasquale's hand position being around the neck of D1527, with Mr. Pasquale's thumbs being driven into the neck and throat area. At paragraph 12 over the page, you considered whether Mr. Pasquale could have been using the mandibular angle technique, MAT, which is a pain-inducing technique, but you concluded that he was not, due to it being in the wrong position, that it should have been on the earlobe rather than the throat. And because he did not follow the correct procedure, it also appeared that he wasn't using the MAT technique. Why was it that you commented particularly on the MAT technique there?
Well, from what I recollect, it was a question in discussion with the investigating police officer. They asked me to consider what techniques possibly could have been attempted at the time, and the reason the MAT came up is because the police also use that technique. It's a technique within the police training syllabus, and he did ask specifically, was it the MAT he was trying to do? And my conclusion was it wasn't, because it didn't reflect the mandibular angle technique in any way.
And you've gone on there at paragraph 13, it's the second line down the middle of the page, that it's difficult to establish why the potentially dangerous use of pressure around the neck was used. The detainee was under control and the staff did not appear to be struggling in their attempts to control him. In this instance, after the initial self-harm risk, the initial self-harm risk is relatively low and would not warrant the use of force being applied to a vulnerable area, such as the neck. Can you explain why the neck is particularly a vulnerable area?
Well, obviously, any pressure on the neck carries significant medical implications. Within the medical DVD that all staff receive as part of their use of force training and on every refresher course, the DVD is a mandatory topic that everyone has to watch. So it gets reiterated to staff both through the DVD and through training that any pressure on the neck can have serious consequences.
When you say serious consequences, do you mean possibly death?
Possibly death, yes.
And then continuing at paragraph 14 and over the page, you note that no use of forms were submitted, despite the requirement for all those in use of force to submit one within 72 hours of the incident. Just pausing there, in general, because we heard from some DCOs that they did not realise that they needed to complete, and not necessarily in this incident, but in general terms, they did not realise that they had to complete use of force forms if they did not physically touch the detained person. Is that correct?
If they weren't actually involved, according to the policy and the prison service model, they don't necessarily have to. However, I have found out since I produced that report that actually G4S had a policy in place at the time which said any witnesses should provide a report based on anything they've seen, heard or observed from that actual incident.
So the policy was on a nationwide level was the words involved use
Yes.
in use of force, and would involved be a manager, for example, who was directing.
Yeah, the supervising officer also has a responsibility to fill in. They fill in what we call the front cover, which has a number of tick boxes, but there's also a section there for the supervising officer to fill in as well, which should give detail. My experience, and this probably covers many agencies, is that that section isn't filled in with any real depth or any real detailed information.
And then paragraph 15 on the same page, you said you observed numerous examples of staff using inappropriate comments and giving detailed descriptions of how they use force on detainees. Many of the comments were racist and disrespectful, some of which we've heard in this inquiry. Paragraph 16, you said you comment on the fact that no challenge was made by staff who were present, and this is contrary to the expectation and responsibility of all staff to report wrongdoing. Thank you, Zainab. If you could please bring up your Mr. Collier's next report, which is Annex A, which is SXP 000130. It's page 2, please. This was on the 8th of February, and it's you've said you asked to comment on actions or lack of action of other staff, and you said that there is no evidence of inappropriate behaviour being challenged, and even a degree of intimidation of staff following incidents, as evidenced by DCO Pascali informing staff that the incident was not a use of force. So you asked specifically about what the other staff should have been doing during this incident, and in terms of whether they should have been completing reports. Or the other staff have completed reports, even if they were not Mr. Pascali, even if he didn't complete the report.
Each individual person has their own responsibility to complete a use of force report. That should be collated by the supervising officer or the orderly officer, as it's known at the time. So following any incident, one of their roles is to collate all the use of force reports, ensure that everybody involved has completed their statement, and also to make sure that the F213 medical report is completed as well.
Thank you, Zainab. If you could just bring up Mr. Collier's last report, which is CPS 000004, which is Annex B to your report. That was completed a few weeks later on the 28th of February, and it's page 2, paragraph 4, please. You asked by police to comment on Mr. Pascali's comments made in interview, which I should say have been maintained during the evidence given to this inquiry as well. In particular, that Mr. Pascali said he was trying to stop him swallowing something, and he was trying to save his life rather than hurting him. It was a medical emergency, and he had not been trained to respond to this type of situation, so responded as he believed was reasonable. You refer at paragraph 5 to the use of force training manual, which I've already referred to, which states that under no circumstances should staff put on any body weight or hold the neck, or otherwise a blockage to the airway can occur, which can lead to unconsciousness and death, and that there is that it says that it's never appropriate to hold a prisoner around the neck. You've already told us why that is. Paragraph 7, just scrolling down, you say that at no time is there any dialogue to indicate that the detained person had anything concealed in his mouth, or that Jan Pascali had any concerns about the detained person choking. Your expectation would be that a DCO would put him in a recovery position and would shout medical emergency and not continue with pressure around the neck. Thank you. Can take that down, please. In your first report, it's page 158, paragraph 663, you say that having considered your previous reports, obviously, all of the footage that we now have, and I think the only additional document you had was the PSU report to what you had originally when considering this matter for the police. You say that your previous report remains unaltered, as there is nothing to support or justify the actions observed by the member of staff or the dialogue which was completely inappropriate and unprofessional. You comment at pages 19 to 20 of your report, since you were asked to consider whether last resort or reasonable, proportionate or no more than necessary, you said, in terms of the last resort, the action to cut the ligature was correct and the only action available, and unable to comment on the next phase where a restraint is initiated. Thus, I assume you're talking about the restraints of Mr. Pasquale.
Yes, it was, yeah. When I commented on it was necessary to cut the ligature, I think that was absolutely correct.
I'm sorry, just pause there. And that was a specific incident which had a specific use of force report,
yes,
which you've considered.
Yes.
That's not the restraints that we're talking about in terms of what we saw on Panorama.
Yeah.
And what do you mean that you're unable to comment on the next phase of restraint where it's initiated?
Because the incident had gone from obviously somebody making an act of self-harm or attempting self-harm to the ligature being cut to ending up in a restraint with the detained person on their back. And what there isn't is any evidence of that gap between the two from what happened at one stage and how they ended up in that position with 3 officers controlling him.
So essentially, is it that you didn't know what the aim of the restraint was, so you couldn't say whether it was a last resort or a first resort or whatever?
Or the justification.
Yes.
Yeah.
You've said at paragraph 49 of your first report, when assessing whether it was reasonable, proportionate or necessary, that the restraint is not captured from the outset, so I'm unable to comment, as you've just said, on how D1527 ended up in the supine position, but that the technique used by DCO Pasquale whilst controlling a head in the supine position does not meet any of the general principles. It was disproportionate and potentially injurious. In terms of whether it was force that was used that was no more than necessary, you said what is seen from the covert camera is more than necessary. And Rule 41.2, provoke, punish or punish a detainee, you've said the language used by DCO Pasquale was provoking, disrespectful and unprofessional. In addition, they could cause further distress to D1527, who was clearly in a state of crisis, and it could be interpreted that he was being punished by Jan Pasquale when you consider the language used. You said this is the most concerning case based on the potential risk the technique used by Mr. Pasquale presented at D1527. Any pressure applied to the neck or throat area can result in serious injury, and techniques of this type form no part of the restraint syllabus. In addition, the professional standards expected of a DCO are not followed, and the demeaning and insulting language heard bring the agency into disrepute. The failure of staff to provide documented evidence of their actions in a use of force statement does not comply with the policy or their individual responsibility. Have you watched or read any of Jan Pasquale's evidence to this inquiry?
I've read some, haven't watched any, no.
And is there anything from what Mr. Pasquale has said to this inquiry that changes your mind?
No, I don't buy into what he's trying to indicate he was trying to do at the time.
What do you mean by that? Could you explain a bit more?
Yeah, he was saying that it was obviously looking at trying to retrieve something from the mouth of the detained person, and I don't see how the technique or what he was doing, I wouldn't call it a technique, the action he was carrying out in any way would support that or would assist with that at that time. I think for me what's even more concerning is that the reports weren't completed by the other staff and it wasn't addressed by anyone, because I think an action of that kind, because of the seriousness, should have been reported by other members of staff in some way, shape or form.
You said that his actions were provocative in your report, and that the accounts that he gave about there being something in his mouth essentially is not supported by evidence. Do you think his actions were deliberate?
Yes.
Now, I want to move on now to the second theme of your report, which is staff incompetence. We'll go from what you've described then as deliberate in terms of the D1527 incident to at least what is incompetent, perhaps on the other side of the scale. In your first report, and pages 157 to 58, paragraphs 661 to 662, you conclude that DCAs are applying techniques incorrectly with little guidance given by colleagues. What proportion of the use of force incidents which you reviewed, the 43 incidents, would you say that there were issues in relation to staff competence?
I think quite a few, and they varied in their severity. There were a couple of incidents, certainly involving D149, where what it done, it kind of made the situation a lot worse, and it caused the reaction from the detained person. In part, was down to the incompetence of staff and the way the techniques were being applied. There were others where it was more minor things that was a best way to describe it is need a little bit of fine tuning, and that's where you'd expect experienced colleagues. And if I'm drifting now, please excuse me, but it's where my recommendation about the governance and the oversight and the review of incidents should be picking up matters of that nature to ensure best practice, to provide safe practice, but also to develop staff both confidence and ability as well.
So it's not just individual DCOs level not applying the techniques properly, it's the managers that are not supervising the DCOs to apply the correct techniques. Absolutely, yes. And you've referred to there being serious incidents and then just fine-tuning. Is it possible to say the proportion of use of force incidents you reviewed where there were quite more significant concerns about staff competence? Couldn't give a percentage-wise, but certainly it would be in double figures, the amount of incidents that I looked at, thinking there's a lot there that somebody should have picked up, that should have been addressed, where there were failings on the supervision of the incident by both the supervisor and, as I say, from the post-incident review that should have taken place. So would that be around half, or...? Probably wouldn't go that, probably about 25%. 25%. So, yeah. You've mentioned the D149 incident, which is something that we're going to come on to it in a moment. You particularly pick out 4 incidents where you've said that you have concerns about the technical ability of the DCO ranks. They're incidents 135, 81, 164 and 162. It's 135 that we'll come on to. And you say that the lack of knowledge does not help in providing a safe environment and, as evidence, can be potentially injurious during different restraints. So we'll look now at the first example, which is incident 13517 involving D149 on the 31st of May 2017. I'm going to summarise, and you can tell me whether this is a fair summary, the incident from your report at pages 21 to 22 and paragraphs 54 to 55. And then we're going to watch some of the footage. The detained person was being moved to CSU following an earlier incident where he took DCO Tully's keys. He was identified as an escape risk, so it was decided that he should be moved to CSU. DCM Loughton made an effort to try and get him to walk to CSU, but received a negative response. Eventually, a planned intervention was prepared with staff in full PPE, and handheld and body-worn footage was present to record the incident. After managing to encourage the detained person out of the room, there was a stalemate where the detained person refused to move and constantly asked for what reason. The DCM then instructed the staff to forcibly remove him. It was an extremely difficult removal. The detained person constantly dropped his body weight and made repeated attempts to kick, knee, trip staff. Handcuffs were applied, but the behaviour continued. Eventually, he was moved to CSU using a full relocation technique. He continued to be verbally abusive and threatening towards staff. For this incident, it was perhaps one of the rare incidents where you'd received different types of footage. You'd had body-worn footage, a handheld camera, and also undercover filming. If we can now view, please, in closed session, disc 53, ST120002. And it's, if Zainab, you need the CGS number, it's CGS 0074 113. Apologies, it's CGS 0074114. Whilst that's being being processed, I have to bring it up in a moment, please. There are 3 criticisms that you make, and I'd like, with your help, to go through and to point out exactly at which points we can see those particular issues. 1 is being kept in the prone position longer than necessary. 2 is not ensuring a safe exit in terms of the figure 4 leg restraint, and the 3rd is in relation to a pain-inducing technique. So if we can start, please, at the beginning. Can I just check, sorry, that we're enclosed?
Ready? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're back in open session.
Thank you. So DCM Lawton says there, so there's I'll repeat what I said before, there's 1 minute 40 of negotiation. DCM Lawton says something like, that's it, that's enough talking. Was that enough talking in your view to persuade the detained person to come out of the room?
I think the main thing is that the detained person was asking a question that he wasn't getting an answer to. If you hear it, he kept saying, for what reason, and there was no explanation given. Now, it may have been given earlier, but I think it would have been good practice to have actually explained to him why he was being moved at that stage. Now, it shouldn't be a secret because the detained person would find out sooner or later about why they'd been moved anyway, and I think they have a justifiable right to be told why they're being moved. So rather than you're being moved, it wasn't explanation enough. So I would have expected a little bit more engagement and a little bit more detail given the reasons for the removal.
And that's in terms of the reasons given. What about the timings? 1 minute 40. Is that enough time to negotiate with someone?
No, and there was no obvious threat or risk to staff. He was quite clear. He was actually showing. The detained person was actually showing his open hands, because I think at one point he made a comment to someone, "Don't clench your fist. Look at me. I've got my hands." So I think he was willing to engage, but he just wanted some answers, to be honest with you.
And so you've mentioned the 3 points in which staff have shown the incompetence in terms of the techniques that were used. Is it also possible that this was not used as a last resort?
Yes, I think there was definite more scope there to engage.
Please, can we go back into closed session so that we can play the rest? Thank you. Thank you. We saw there the detained person's hand being twisted by an officer. Was that a pain-inducing technique, do you think? Is that a recognisable one? Yeah,
that is what we would describe as wrist flexion, which is one of the pain-inducing techniques that can be used in extreme circumstances. It was applied, I think the detained person had a bit of a clenched fist, but it was the same action of actually flexing the wrist. And obviously with the handcuff being applied, that increases the pressure point as the pain is being induced, yes.
And should a pain-inducing technique be used when handcuffed in that position, after handcuffs have been applied?
It can be, but in extreme circumstances, and I think at the moment all they were encountering was someone who was resistant being moved. The other point, I'm sorry if I'm jumping the gun on this one, is that if it had been applied, it should have followed the correct procedure, which would be to give an instruction. So the first thing would be to instruct the detained person what you actually wanted them to do, or what you were asking them to do, give them a clear warning, then apply the pressure, and then ease the pressure off, and hopefully get a successful outcome.
You said it should only be used in extreme circumstances where somebody is being handcuffed. someone has been handcuffed? And is that because, in general, when somebody is handcuffed, they're already under control?
There's a greater element of control rather than just relying on physical holds, yes.
So it's about it not being necessary
Yes.
in those circumstances. And is it also because there is a greater risk to injury?
Definitely, yes.
And you said it should only be used in extreme circumstances. Were the circumstances you saw here extreme?
No.
So in those circumstances, was the pain-inducing technique appropriate with this detained
In my
person?
opinion, at that point, no.
Please could we go back now into closed to play the last part of the video. I just want to ask you about your comments at what was seen at the end of the video. In terms of the handcuffs, was there an issue with the time that it took to take off those handcuffs?
Yes, that should have been, I hate to put a time scale on it, but certainly less than about sort of 30, 45 seconds maximum. So I think we were nearly at 3 minutes there to get the handcuffs off. I would, as much as I appreciate that staff need exposure to operational situations, I think bearing in mind the complexities around this particular incident, bringing in someone who clearly was inexperienced, because if the DCM at the door actually asked one of the staff to talk the member of staff through the the removal of the handcuffs, I don't believe that was the right time or place, bearing in mind that incident and the difficulties they'd had and the duration of the incident, to put someone in who was inexperienced when there was an experienced DCM there that should have been more than capable of removing them much swifter.
And in terms of the criticisms you make in your report, these seem to be additional criticisms that you've picked up again from looking at the footage about the use of the handcuffs and the positioning of the hands. Is that right?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier on that the problem they had at removing the handcuffs was due to the incorrect application in the first place. So if that had been addressed earlier, that would have removed that problem that occurred later on, which again, I said at the time, the supervisor should, when it was identified, they should have been changed and altered. The handcuffs didn't have to be in a flattened out prone position. Could have been done standing up, could have been done kneeling down. So, and that would have then reduced that risk at the end.
And what was the risk of?
Being placed face down for an extended period. So we've got a prolonged prone restraint. We've also got the added issue of the hands being behind the back and being controlled as well. So that again has an impact on the capabilities for normal function of breathing. So again, it's something that's highlighted in training. It should be held for the minimum period absolutely necessary at that time.
So you've covered there the prone position being longer than necessary. And what about the figure 4 leg restraints? Could you explain to us what we saw there and what should have actually happened?
So what should have happened? Throughout the removal of the handcuffs, somebody should have still been controlling the head of the detained person because to stop it hitting the ground or inadvertently injuring himself.
Just pause there. Is there another reason why it's important to have an officer by the head?
Yes, to also to communicate and explain what's going on, because although he understood that the handcuffs were being attempted, someone should be reassuring him that the handcuffs were being removed. Once they were removed, staff would be exiting, he'd be relocated in the room on his own, yes.
And why was it important to reassure him about the handcuffs being removed?
I think it's the fear factor. He can't see what's going on, doesn't understand what's going on. I don't know the background of the individual involved, but it could be recollections of previous events. You don't know what's happened in the past. So it could be a whole host of reasons, but it's to alleviate them fears and concerns.
And in terms of the leg restraint itself, you said in your report, paragraph 87, the first report, that it was positioned incorrectly and that there was officers trying to compensate by forcibly pulling the detained person's legs and that his feet were twisted, causing him pain. How should it have been done?
Well, everything should be in a straight alignment, so the legs should be sort of lifted straight to the rear and supported by a member of staff. What you actually saw was, one, the foot being twisted, but also the ankle being, rather than sort of central alignment to the member of staff, it was actually to their side. So what that would do, that would pressure both on the hips and the knee joint. And it would also raise the hips as well and pull the hips to one side, which when you've got someone controlling you as well, there's no manoeuvre for you to actually move to take away the pressure that's there. So because of that, then all them factors together caused, again, possible medical issues, possible injury, but also pain at the time and discomfort.
And just returning to the prone position, you said that he was in the prone position for longer than necessary. What are the medical risks of somebody being in that position, face down, with their hands handcuffed behind their back for a long period of time?
For a long period of time, obviously with all the anxiety and all the stress and the fatigue from the restraint, because he'd been very active and very resistant, so there is that kind of fatigue and exhaustion there, in which case your breathing rate needs to increase. You need to inflate more oxygen into your body. So because he's in the inability to be able to perform that normally or at a level required at the time, that possibly then he could start to experience some breathing difficulties. Extended periods has unfortunately in the past led to fatalities.
You mentioned that there was a period in the video where the detained person was walking compliantly.
Yeah.
Was it therefore necessary to continue the use of handcuffs and to put the detained person in that position?
I believe so, and my reasons being are the level of resistance, and because of the threats that were being made, I think it was the right decision if carried out correctly. And like I said earlier, the whole relocation process of taking handcuffs out and getting the staff safely out of the room shouldn't have taken no more than a minute in an ideal scenario, and there was no resistance at the time, so there was nothing to cause that to be extended in that period.
Ms. Collier, I now need to unfortunately do something which isn't going to be very interesting for you or for us here, but it's to read out part of the transcript that was played in closed session. It was my fault. We should have gone back and forth into open session so that we could hear your comments in open session. But if I can just do that briefly so that anybody watching is able to hear your evidence in about those specific incidents where we paused the video. So I'll just do that now quickly. Miss Townsend, I said, Zainab, whilst that's happening, if you could play from 4 minutes 30, please. The video is played. No, thank you. And then I say, just pause there. I'm not going to ask to go back in. We'll comment on it at the end. But is there anything wrong with the technique of the handcuffs there? You say, yes, the handcuffs haven't been applied correctly. And if you look on the footage there, as we are looking at it on our left-hand side, that shouldn't be replicated on the other side, when in fact the other hand is held in a different angle. Now the correct position is what we call back-to-back. So if you can imagine the backs of the hands are actually alongside each other. That hadn't been applied there, and the other hand was almost turned face in, so that the cause is pressure through the wrist, just with the cuff being applied, without even the staff putting their arms on or applying any kind of control of the arm. I say thanks. We'll come back to handcuff use in the end. Carry on, please, playing the clip. Thank you. The video is then played. I say pause there. We can see there the hand in one position, the left hand against the back, and the right hand is straight down on the right. You say yes. The video is then played again. I say pause there. You can see the same issue there, can't you, with the arm position? You say you can, and just slightly before that, if you look at the footage, you can see a gap on the side of the cuff, which indicates that the wrist is being forced against one side of the cuff, whereas it should be equally in the middle of the handcuff. I ask, is that to do with the tightness of the handcuff? You say, one, it's a little bit to do with the tightness, but if you look at the arm on the right-hand side, the member of staff is hooked under the arm. That's actually pushing the elbows and the arms away, which is causing that pressure to the extreme part or the outer side of the handcuff. Apologies if I'm getting too technical, but I'm trying to break it down. I say, no, that's very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Collier. If we could continue, please. The video is played. I say, can you explain what's happening here? You answer, it appears that somebody has identified that the cuffs have been incorrectly applied and that they have summoned the DCM to come in and adjust them. So they've looked as though they have gone and made some sort of effort to, but haven't actually changed anything. I say, if we can continue, please, the video is played. I say, if we can just go into open so that we can please for a moment so that we can have Mr. Collier's open comments. Thank you, in open session. I want to then turn to a conversation after the incident between Callum Tully and Dave Webb. You mentioned your first report at page 24, paragraph 27, that Mr. Tully then asked the college, did you get digs in? And the reply was inaudible. And we've got the transcript. We can bring that up on screen. It's TRN 00000088, page 20. And Callum Tully there says, actually this is on the 1st of June, so just after this, you managed to get any digs in? Dave Webb says, hurt. He said, you managed to get any digs in? Dave Webb said, I fucking hurt, inaudible. Gary Crouch stands up and leaves the room. Dave Webb says, I fucking hurt, big time. When I put him in a straight hold in the office downstairs, heard screaming. Callum Tully, haha. Dave Webb, inaudible. Put my weight behind, inaudible. Callum Tully, if you go around threatening people, mate, what do you expect? Gary Croucher enters the room, sits down. Dave Webb, it's nothing personal, nothing personal. But if you're going to be a fucking dick, it's going to hurt, isn't it? So we see there that the transcripts picked up the rest of the conversation in terms of did you get any digs in. Would you agree that it appears that Dave Webb is bragging about hurting a detained person?
It does, and I think I can, if it's the officer who I identified on the footage, the actual point where that actually applied, where he early on in the restraint, he puts in what we call a straight arm lock, and you can hear a kind of reaction from D149 at that stage. So I think that would, looking at that I think is where that comes applicable.
And he says, big time, as in fucking hurt him big time. That suggests that he hurt him rather a lot.
Yeah.
Would you agree that it appears that it may have even been, it appears that it could have been deliberate even, by the way that he's talking?
From what he says there, yes.
And that would be inappropriate given the guidelines relating to the pain-inducing techniques, which you've already mentioned.
Yeah. Yes.
And in particular that it should only be used for a very short amount of time where absolutely necessary.
Yes.
I want to now move on to a second example, which is 8117 D1234. We've seen the footage already, but I do want to play it again. We have played it twice, but I want to play it again so that you can tell us about the techniques. Don't worry, this can be played in open. In terms of the review of the incident in your first report, you say that this is a page 37, paragraphs 134 to 135. This is a summary. You say that the detained person was subject to a removal order on a charter flight, and despite attempts of DCM Dix for him to walk to the escort vehicle, he refused. A team were assembled to carry out a planned removal, and they were all issued with PPE. After a further attempt failed, the team were deployed into the room, and the detainee stripped naked and started chanting. He resisted all attempts to control him, and eventually handcuffs were applied. During the removal, it was decided the only method of moving... Oh, I'm sorry, I've just said his name. We just have to pause there. I'm sorry.
So what will happen now, Mr. Collier, is we have to cut the feed because there was an inadvertent
Yes.
breach. When we go back in, Ms. Townsend will explain, and I...
I'd like to apply for a restriction order covering that detained person's names. There is a general one in place, but just to make sure.
Thank you, Ms Townsend. So, as you say, there is a general restriction order in place. This is me formally making a specific restriction order for an inadvertent breach of a former detained person's name.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll continue.
During the removal, it was decided that the only method of moving the detained person was to carry him. He was carried by the staff, and once they reached the discharge area, he was handed over to task force staff. He was placed in a waist restraint belt, and leg restraints were also used. Paragraph 135, task force staff escorted the detained person to Stansted Airport, but the flight was cancelled. He complained of several injuries received during the restraint. If we can play, please, Disc 23 S19400003, CGS 0073737 and this can be played in open.
This is being played in open. Thank you.
And it's the first 7 minutes 40.
Are you going to... Are you going to walk out the room? I have a team here. If you don't walk out the room, they will come and distract you. So you need to stand up. Are you going to come out? Just flick the camera up to protect his mother. We've just flicked the camera up due to his naked to try and protect his modesty. The audio will remain. Just come in a bit and see what you need. As he's coming up. So now he's coming up. Let's get him up. Okay, he's not engaging, but let's go through the techniques. Sitting. Let's sit him
Pause for a second, please. You've criticised in your report about the excessive pushing down of the detained person's head. I think we just saw it there. It was quite difficult to see. But how exactly was an officer doing that, and should they have been doing that?
The position the detained person was in was on their back. The staff at the times were raising the arms upwards. By pushing the head down, what you're actually doing is working against the mechanics of the body. So the arms are going one way and the head's being forced in a different way. What the person controlling the head should have done was supported the head by the side, prevented it from inadvertently hitting the ground or injuring himself, and placing it and controlling it until such time as the staff got some form of control and holds on the arms.
You've said in your report, first report, page 39, paragraph 143, it's not necessary and is excessive use of force, which should be identified by the supervisor and stopped immediately. What risk of injury could be caused by that excessive pushing down of the detainee's head?
It's a mixture of both sort of musculoskeletal injuries by, as I say, working one part of the body against the other. So it could have caused injuries either to the elbows or to the neck area, but also by making direct contact with the floor as well, because obviously they were on the floor. They didn't have full control at the time. Where the footage is actually held there, you can see that the supervising officer is in a really good position to observe everything that's going on and to pick up the actions of the staff and identify anything that's potentially injurious to both staff or the detained person.
If we could carry on, if you could keep the dial on the bottom so I can see the timestamps, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, I'm trying to read. These are the hours. These are the hours. These are the hours. These are the hours. Our bit has
Gus, you need to stand up.
Jesus.
That's it.
Jesus.
Just pause there, please. Can we then fast forward to 7 minutes 10? Thank you. Just pause there, please. So this is the carrying technique,
Yes.
which you have some comments to make. I'll ask you for those comments once we've seen the video. Thank you.
If he kicks out, Sean, then we give the legs.
Sorry, this. Land of England. Land of England. Land of England. We can win. 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 We can win.
Okay, so Sean, when we get through the next door, we give him the option to walk around it. If he doesn't answer, we continue the left.
We can win. We can win. We can win.
If you're out of time, like, there's no rush to it, I'll put you forward. Okay. So, give it a shot, don't put him down. You're going to walk. Let's have a rest. Let's have a rest. Okay. Let's keep lifting. Okay. Okay, let's have a breath. Go on. Okay, we do it in our own time. Okay, so you want to just take a breath. Are you going to stand up and walk? So, if you're not going to stand up and walk, the lift will have to continue. Okay? Don't do that. So, obviously, that's the answer. Okay? So, again, guys, if we want to swap positions round, we need to look at that. Jordan, how are you? Just get it done. Okay. Very good.
Hold that there. Hold that on. You've got to take control.
Just stop there, thank you. Bring that down, thank you very much. You criticised this incident in 3 ways. The first is what we've is something we've already covered about excessive pushing down of the detained person's head. And the second is the application of handcuffs whilst in seated position. And the third is the carrying technique. If we can just look at the application of handcuffs whilst in the seated position, what's the problem with having handcuffs in a seated position?
When the medical review took place for the development of a system for the Home Office for people being escorted on aircrafts and in vehicles, one of the major concerns was someone being seated and being pushed forward. It relates back to a previous case that involved a death under restraint. And from that, the advice we were given by our medical advisors was that actually handcuffing while someone's seated, because you have to flex someone forward in order to get the handcuffs applied, could put undue pressure around the torso, and again interfere with the normal breathing, application of breathing, inflating the chest, everything else. even more so when somebody's sort of exhausted state, or somebody's at a heightened state of sort of aggression or anxiety. So it was changed at that point, which was around about 2015.
And how would have this change, so it's removed from the 2015 manual, because it's a removing of something, it might have been more difficult to have checked unless someone was going line through line. How was that communicated to staff?
So from January 2016, that would have been included within the instructor revalidation course. So any local instructor, once they're initially qualified, attend one of the 2 national training centres every year to be reaccredited. And it was cascaded through that course, whereby it was to be removed from training delivery when they returned to their establishments.
That training, is that the refresher training that every DCO...
And initial and refresher training, yes.
I see. And so therefore, these officers ought to have known in 2017 that that technique ought not to have been used.
Yes, because they'd have had a yearly refresher, and they'd have had a refresher somewhere during 2016 at least.
Just briefly, while we're on this topic, I've been asked by Innovo Law to ask you this question. Is it good practice for refreshers to be on site, given the concerns that have been raised in this inquiry? For example, personal relationships with the use of force instructors and so on.
What, delivered locally? Is that the question? Or?
Yes, is it good practice for refreshers to be delivered on site? So rather than at perhaps one of the centres in Kidlington or...
Well, the centres at Kidlington are for the trainers. The trainers then, there's something around 600 instructors nationally across many different sectors. So, and obviously we've got a large number of staff, both prison service from approved agencies to train, which couldn't be accommodated at the centres. So the model we use is a cascade of training through local instructors.
And do you see any problem with the use of force instructors within the same institutions teaching the staff of that institution?
No, because that's the model we've used since use of force, CNR as it's called at the time, for the last 30 plus years.
We've dealt then now with the problems with the handcuffs. You've also said in page 42 of your first report, paragraph 151, there was a problem with applying the handcuffs. Again, that staff did not demonstrate a working knowledge of how handcuffs could be used. That sounds rather similar to the criticism
Yes.
that you made about D149. Is that a criticism that you could make about other use of force incidents that you've had to review as well?
From recollection, I can't remember any specifics, but certainly that's 2 straight away that we've identified where there is a problem with the application of the handcuffs, yes.
In terms of the carry technique, you say in your first report, page 39, paragraph 142, that the use of force training manual contains guidance of how to carry a person in extreme circumstances. For example, when they continually drop their weight or hook their legs around fixtures and so on. And you say in your report, the same paragraph, that whilst all techniques have scope to adapt to meet unusually difficult circumstances, there is no obvious knowledge of how to even prepare for the correct lift to take place. You say at paragraph 151, the carry technique was poorly managed and executed. Staff appeared unsure of what to do and couldn't recall the training. Do you have anything to add to that from what we've seen in the video?
No, it just reaffirms everything I said in my report. And if I talk about the sort of background to that, the carry technique, it relies on starting from the right position, which might sound a very obvious thing to say, but actually what you have to do is set it up right. What you've got to remember is that the staff are actually lifting someone, so you have to follow some kind of kinetic lifting guidelines, manual handling guidelines, so the techniques have been designed around those principles. Now, if you don't get that right at the start, then unfortunately it's doomed to failure, to be honest with you. And the other major concern was the person controlling the head should have been the person at the back, and the head position should have been completely altered. So in effect, you're almost straightening someone out rather than bending them forward, like you saw on the footage there.
We heard from DCM Dixon live evidence from him about this incident. He accepted that essentially all those three features which you've criticised, about the handcuffs, carry techniques, the excessive pushing down the head, was wrong and shouldn't have occurred. In your conclusion about that incident, you make a recommendation with regards to staff and competence and techniques that are used, and you say your recommendation 1, page 146, that all DCMs should in future receive incident scene management training before taking up post. This can be adapted from the current syllabus by local instructors or preferably designed by HMPPS as a bespoke package. It will focus on scene control and defensible decision making using the model within the use of force training manual, negotiation skills and staff management. New staff should have an additional 1-day refresher after 6 months in post. This will support learning and allow extra training within the techniques that have been struggled with or cannot remember from the initial course. So essentially you're just saying there should be additional training but bespoke on those specific problems which you've seen come up in the review of your 43 incidents.
There was a general lack of scene control on a lot of occasions, and both planned and unplanned. Unplanned is something that's a little bit more difficult to manage because it's unique circumstances, it's unpredicted, you haven't got time to prepare. I think I'm more concerned, well, I'm equally concerned, but more so, if I should say, on the planned incidents. There is a structure in place that should be followed, and on many times some of the real basics just weren't adopted by the person supervising.
So it really is, as we touched on earlier, not just the incompetent techniques which were used by staff on the ground, the DCOs, but also the management of the staff in a particular use of force incident.
It was, and I think reading some of the transcripts of the DCMs that have been given evidence, many of them say that they received no additional training, which again is a major failing in my belief, that for someone to take on a role that requires them and is foreseeable that they will manage incidents that are sometimes complex, sometimes very emotional, as this incident was, that they don't receive any extra training and they rely on shadowing someone for a few weeks or so. So I think that's wholly inadequate.
And when you say it's wholly inadequate in terms of additional training, do you mean that there should be additional training after the incident? So that it should be like this, if it was reviewed properly, it would have brought up specific recommendations of and outlined additional training needs?
No, I think it's more organisationally that for people being promoted, there should be training that is given before they take up post.
I see. I misunderstood. So you mean about DCM training?
Yes. Yes.
So
from
supervisory training.
From progressing from a DCO to a DCM, there
Yes.
should be additional training that covers foreseeable incidents that they need to manage, not just in use of force, but obviously there's a whole host of other areas that the DCM will now take responsibility for.
That's your recommendation. We will hear from Steve Hewer from Serco in relation to whether various recommendations may or may not have already been implemented. We know from the ITC schedule of learning, which we'll look at later, but for the record it's SER 000253. That's the hidden tab on DCO training week 5. That this is new training for new DCOs, that there is on week 5 1.5 days dedicated to conflict management and 1.5 hours dedicated to principles of direct supervision. However, it's not clear, and we may hear evidence on this later, what either of those entail. Is that something that you were looking for, or is that something more?
No, that conflict management is something that all DCOs should receive as part of their initial training. It goes under different names. Sometimes it's called interpersonal skills, managing challenging behaviour. It has a whole host of different terminology, but it amounts to the same thing. It's about dealing with the difficult conversations that staff will engage as part of their role. And I think the other thing I noticed about that was it was on, is it week 5?
Yes.
You said? And that comes after use of force training, which for me is something that's probably the wrong way around. In my opinion, that should come first in the syllabus, with use of force training at the end, so that we're evidencing we've trained people in other skills before they get trained in physical techniques.
And those are the soft skills, the de-escalation techniques.
Yes, yeah, they're the communication skills, yes.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask for a break now. We finished that topic,
Thank you.
15 minutes. Perhaps we can come back at 5:02.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Collier. 052. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Ms Colley, I want to now go to our third topic, which is the topic of use of force against naked detained persons. This is a specific issue. We saw in the clip that we've just played in relation to D1234 that he was naked during that use of force incident. I'm going to take you to a couple of other examples as well where this has happened. In your first report, page 157, paragraph 660, and also in your second report, paragraph 21, you refer to various points concerning the practice of restraining a person who's naked or near naked, which you observe in your first report as a frequent occurrence, and that there is an unusually high amount of incidents, which is said in the second report, paragraph 21. The unusually high incidents quote is actually a quote from Claire Checksfield from the Home Office, which you put in your report. She accounts for the higher occurrence being down to the fact that this is the last day before deportation. And I assume what is meant there that she's referring to somebody removing their clothes as a protest or a way of disrupting removal. Is this something that you've come across in your prison work?
Not to the extent of the relatively short period of time that these incidents were provided that we've been reviewing. It would be a lot higher than what I've experienced personally in a prison environment.
And do you put it down to any other reason than what Claire Checksfield has suggested?
I think the only other conclusion I can draw, and again, it's just my opinion based on the evidence I've seen so far, is because a lot of them have been no-notice removals, so that the staff actually go to the room sort of in the early hours of the morning, and the detained person would be in bed at the time, which would probably account for some of it as well.
So in fact, it's not a deliberate ploy to avoid removal or to frustrate the use of force incident. It's simply a matter of the timing.
On some that I observed, definitely it was just the timing more than the deliberate action, yes.
What challenges did you observe when using force against a naked detainee?
Maintaining dignity, decency, trying to wrap a towel around someone who was actively resisting the staff. It's difficult, and also it's difficult for everyone involved, to be honest with you. So I think it's why I made the comment that because it happens more often, or certainly happened several times over a relatively short period of time, that maybe somebody, if they'd have reviewed the incidents properly and identified what was happening, could have looked at some kind of solution. I
want to take us to the first example. It's example 8817, incident number, and it's it's concerning D2416 on the 11th of April 2017. This is an incident which you changed your mind about having seen the footage in terms of it being or not being a last resort. In your first report, paragraph 421, page 102, you summarise the incident briefly as follows. You say that the detained person refused to walk to the discharge area where task force staff are waiting to remove him for a charter flight to Germany. He was restrained by staff after all attempts to persuade him to walk failed, and he was handcuffed and walked to the discharge area under restraint. For much of the move, he was naked and he refused to dress. Your opinion there is based on written statements from staff due to the fact you didn't have any footage.
That's correct, yes.
You say that all the statements confirm that DCM Farrell tried reasoning and gave him ample opportunity to comply, and that attempts were made to cover him in order to preserve his dignity. You also say that, this is at paragraph 422, that head support was reapplied on the stairs where the detained person tried to place his feet on the railings to disrupt movement. In terms of the last resort, your conclusion in that first report, page 103, paragraph 425, you say that all reasonable efforts were made to comply with the instruction, force was only used when all other avenues failed to get a level of compliance. And now if we can see the footage, this will have to be played in closed, please. It's UOF 88.17 BWC. Thank you. Mr. Collier, in your third report, INQ 000177, page 9, in paragraph 34, you said, the DCM enters the room and informs D2416 of the removal. When D416 removes, a short explanation takes place before the team are deployed. The timeline from starting the conversation to the team applying force is 0013 to 0039, approximately 26 seconds. This is not sufficient time to explain and try persuasion for compliance. My opinion on this being the last resort, paragraph 425, has now changed due to limited attempts made by the DCM. Do you want to add anything about that?
No, it's just the fact that, that it wasn't sufficient time. I think we also have to take in consideration if the time on the footage is right. It was, I think, just after 5 a.m. in the morning. So obviously there's that factor that somebody's asleep and been woken up to sort of comprehend and process what's happening. It wasn't sufficient time before force was initiated.
Paragraph 35, you question why the DCM insisted on head support when moving down the stairs when the detained person was compliant. So there's nothing to support what the DCOs had said about him trying to use his feet on the railings to disrupt movement at this stage. Only later when on the stairs. You can't see this due to the camera being moved away for decency purposes, but this is referenced at 7 minutes 27. So can you just describe what you could see there on the video?
It was more about the fact
or not
that,
see, hear
yeah,
rather.
yeah, what you're hearing. There was nothing there, because normally if someone was struggling or attempting to resist the removal, you would hear staff giving instructions, you would hear the sort of interaction between the detained person and the staff, and people telling him to, because that's the normal thing. If someone tries to prevent you doing something by putting their legs around railings, somebody would say, take your legs away, or somebody would communicate that to colleagues. So there was no verbal interaction between the staff to really evidence that there was any problem with the movement.
And you say you question why DCM insisted on head support when moving down the stairs. How would have head support have helped in that process if he had been locking his legs around the railings at that point?
Limit the movement slightly, because when you're bent forward, you haven't quite got the range of motion with your legs. You can't kick out quite as much, so that would have helped in that circumstance. But at the time, there's no clear need for why the head support was also needed.
Was that head support disproportionate then at that time?
Yes, if there was no need for it to be used and the movement was moving freely, so to speak, then applying head support when it's not necessary is disproportionate, yes.
You say at paragraph 36 of your statement that he was taken, of your report, the third report, that he was taken to the bottom of stairs and task force staff were there to escort him, that he was left naked in the presence of at least 7 staff between 8 minutes 50 and 17 minutes 35, so almost 10 minutes. He said that this appears to be whilst trying to find a sheet, and that you find it unacceptable and degrading because there would have been ample opportunity to arrange clothing beforehand, and only necessary staff ought to have been present. Although this is an example of use of force, of degrading treatment, as you've put it, due to the detained person being left naked for a lengthy period, it's also an example, isn't it, of force being used not as a last resort.
Yes.
He was given, as you said, 26 seconds to comply. Was that an ample opportunity, 26 seconds, at that time in the morning, for him to have complied?
Nowhere near enough, no.
What ought to have happened?
Should have engaged for longer, should have given the detained person a chance to sort of, dare I say it, wake up properly and process what was happening and the instructions, and then engage in conversation, explaining in more detail what was happening and the requirements to be moved.
In addition to that, you've identified a mismatch between what the officers report and what in fact the footage shows. So you said that DCM Farrell tried reasoning and gave him ample opportunity to comply. And you put that in your first report as correct and as the truth before you'd seen the footage.
Yes.
But that didn't actually accord with the reality, did it, from watching the footage?
No, what was written in the use of force report and what that indicated wasn't reflected on the actual footage and what actually happened. No.
And does that concern you, this mismatch between what a DCM said actually happened and what we saw on the footage?
It would be that the DCM felt that they'd given, more so that the DCM felt they'd given ample opportunity, which if their perception that 26 seconds is ample opportunity, then that raises serious concerns, yes.
Could it also have been not that it necessarily was his perception, but in fact he was giving a different account on purpose? Is that a possibility?
Can't really comment on that because it's obviously his perception at the time. But yes, it's a failing on his part that he didn't engage longer. And again, I will go back to something I said earlier: a proper incident review by a cross body of staff. That's the sort of thing you'd expect to be picked up, and that's the sort of thing that a DCM would be sort of notified of and addressed with them, because they haven't, as you say, used force as the last resort.
I want to take you to another example, which is the restraints of excuse me, D5054, and it's incident 162-17. The same person was restrained whilst naked on the 28th of June. You considered it in your report, no need to turn to it now, on the first report, INQ 00011, page 74, and also in your second report, INQ 0000158, page 9, paragraph 1.4, you find the continued use of force excessive in relation to this incident. We know from the detained person's medical records that the detained person suffered from serious mental health issues at the time, was awaiting an urgent mental health assessment, and early that morning had self-harmed and been moved to E-Wing on constant watch. He was naked with only a towel covering his groin for a long period of time and handed over to Taskor, during which you noted, having seen the footage, that there was a lengthy pause in movement. And you say that in your first report, page 76, paragraph 302. Do you accept that in circumstances where the detainee who is subject to restraint whilst naked and whilst they suffer from mental illness or other related vulnerabilities, that this would be an additional factor which would aggravate the nature and impact of this treatment as humiliating or degrading?
Yes, it would, yes.
About D2416, in your first report, paragraph 660, you said, although staff made all reasonable efforts to preserve the dignity of the detainee, even after restraints were applied, I'm surprised that they have not looked at options for wrapping around a naked detainee, especially considering it is a frequent occurrence. And we'll move on now to your recommendation in relation to that, this problem.
Yes.
Recommendation 2, which you describe at paragraph 664 of your report, which is the design of a smock. Could you explain a bit more what you mean by that? What
I think
it would
smock's
be?
just a general term, but some garment that can be easily placed over the detained person whilst naked that at least covers up the areas that shouldn't be on show.
And have you seen this being used in any other custodial settings?
No, it's nothing of experience, but that's again relates to the fact that it hasn't been a major problem before. But because it's a more frequent event in this situation, it's something that I think should have been identified and something somebody could have considered along the lines. It doesn't have to be anything that you take to mass production, even if they made something locally or got a seamstress, so to speak, just to make something up. It's
The inquiry hasn't heard or seen any evidence to suggest this particular issue is being addressed, and we heard evidence from Steve Dix in his live evidence, which is at INQ 0000167, page 8, internal page 30, that there was no policy or guidance as to do with what to do with detained persons who are naked when using force. Can you confirm that there isn't any guidance in relation to that, not including the smocks, but any other kind of guidance?
no, as I said earlier on today, the manual covers a range of basic techniques that can be adapted, and you can't foresee every perceivable incident that staff will be required to attend.
And are there other measures that could be put in place to preserve dignity? For example, giving more of an opportunity for a detained person to dress, or persuading them to dress?
Yeah, that's your obvious part. And that goes back to the original comment that if longer was spent engaging, giving someone time, even producing clothing for them and ask them to put it on, that's all part of the, as you say, the persuasion and negotiation phase.
Because in the two clips that we saw, which involve naked detainees, D1234 and D416, that didn't happen, did it? No persuasion or even command to put clothes on was issued.
No, and if it was, it may have only been once, but again, it's something that you would continually build into any conversations that you encounter.
And could another measure be taken, such as prioritising the obtaining of clothing to reduce time waiting for it? Because we saw in that last clip that it took almost 10 minutes for any clothing to appear. So could that have been prioritised?
I think that's something that should have been identified and done as an automatic part of any removals process, to have clothing available should someone, especially for the early morning interventions, yes.
And with D416, we saw that he also had to wait for a considerable period whilst there were 7 members of staff around. Could that also have been reduced, the number of staff, whilst he was naked and waiting for
There's two
clothing?
things they could have done. I wouldn't have even think it acceptable to hold him in that place there. I think he should have been taken to a room or somewhere isolated, rather than be in an area, because it was only by chance that somebody was on the gate there to stop any movement. But you could have had a free flow of other staff coming through at any time. So I think at that stage, for me, he should have been removed somewhere else.
So ought there to be a specific policy or procedure in place, given the frequency in which it occurs and the consequence for the detained person, humiliation, if no action is taken?
Because of the frequency of these type of events, there should be something like locally agreed protocols. Everyone's aware of the decency agenda. Any full searching of a detained person or in a prison environment will only be by 2 staff of the same sex. So anything above that is starting then to encroach on that policy alone, although it's not a search, but it's the basis of that is that persons shouldn't have multiple people around them whilst being in a state of undress.
But the same principles could apply to a separate policy about use of force against naked or undressed
Yeah,
detained
absolutely,
persons.
yes.
And that could include what we've just been speaking about, giving opportunities to dress, prioritising obtaining clothing, being in a private area, reducing numbers of staff and so on.
Yes.
I want to move on now to the fourth topic, which you've highlighted in your report, and that's the lack of de-escalation and the use of PPE. You said in your first report, page 156, paragraph 658, that there is for you an area of concern around the cultural process of automatically resorting to PPE, and you reference D87, which is incident 164 165. You say in your first report at page 29, paragraph 101, when speaking about D1914, which is an incident we're going to look at in detail, that PSO 1600, role of supervisor, paragraph 4.34, states the provision of PPE is optional. Each case should be judged individually and only where necessary should PPE be worn. Removing PPE as a de-escalation tool once the risk of injury to staff has been mitigated should follow the initial intervention. What do you mean, firstly, by cultural process of automatically resorting to PPE?
So, first of all the footage that I saw, every planned intervention was staff in PPE. There was also references in staff statements about if it was planned, any planned incident is in full PPE, which is not the case. And I think the perception culturally and from further evidence, including some of the transcripts and some of the evidence given at this hearing, is that even from senior manager level down, that everybody's perception is that if it's planned, you have to put staff in full PPE. So it goes right the way through, which is probably why everybody seems to have that. And in fact, that's why it's the culture, isn't it? It's come from the top and it's worked its way through.
Yes, because we heard live evidence from Nathan Ring and DCM Steve Lawton on exactly that topic, as you've said. Live evidence from Nathan Ring, which is INQ 000151, page 7, internal page 107. He says, with a planned use of force, you were in full PPE. There was no half or not. There was never a planned use of force when you weren't in PPE. There was no half measures. And DCM Steve Lawton, so obviously more senior, says at INQ 000155, page 28, internal page 110, he thought that always wearing PPE for planned use of force is what's in the use of force manual. Can you explain whether that is in fact correct?
No, it's not correct. The section in the use of force manual that staff would have been trained in is actually titled, it's called prisoner, because obviously it's based on prison. It's called armed prisoner removal. So when there's a visible weapon or intelligence to indicate that a weapon is present, and therefore it's there to protect staff against injuries from that weapon.
Should we go to the manual? It's at and if we can, Zainab, please bring up on the screen N0000001. It's the use of force training manual, page 201. It's paragraph 8.1. See there at the top there, that may, and I'm emphasising may, be occasions when staff must wear suitable approved protective clothing and equipment. Examples are when, and you've just been through some of these, prisoner is behaving aggressively, there is a known risk of aggressive behaviour, the prisoner has or is likely to have weapons available. I'm going to bring that down, please. Can we now turn to the relevant PSO 1600, which is INQ 000185, page 39, please. This is Appendix F. The second paragraph down. It is recommended that all staff are provided with and wear protective equipment in planned CNR. Bring that down, thank you. So PSO 1600 states PPE is recommended, and the training manual say it may be used. Therefore, it's essentially optional. Yeah. What is taught in training?
Exactly that, is that each situation should be evaluated on its own unique circumstances. If there is a genuine risk to staff from potential weapons, or even within a difficult environment, and by that I mean a prison cell, for instance, with lots of furniture, or if there's debris, damage has been caused where people may get injured during the restraint process, to provide PPE for the safety and welfare of the staff. However, if there is no need for PPE, for instance, there's no visible weapons, there's no serious threats of aggression, then consideration should be that staff don't wear. And I think that goes back to what one of the witnesses said. There's no half measures. You either wear it or you don't. But there is the don't as well. So, and there's no, like, you can only wear some parts, but not all of it.
Is there a half measure, though, in taking the PPE off during an incident?
Yes, and I think that was just on the actual, what you put up on the screen there. So the expectation is that once control has been gained, once the initial threat and risk to staff has been resolved, then the minimum that should be replaced is the shield and the helmets. And also in training, we often advocate as well that the gloves are removed. And if I explain a little bit more about that, the gloves are equivalent of a riot glove, so a public order glove as they're known, which are quite bulky and have a lot of protection. So that makes fine and complex skills like applying handcuffs, applying restraints, head support, slightly more difficult. So that's why we advocate gloves are removed as well.
And could you explain how it is a de-escalation tool, removing the PPE during an incident?
I think the impression it would give, because if you're being restrained by people with helmets on, communication is really difficult. And one of the roles of the person supervising the control of the head is to communicate with the person being restrained. So trying to communicate through a visor is muffled, whereby if the helmet comes off, you can then get that face-to-face conversation going and build up that rapport to try and de-escalate. And also you can show a sense of compliance by staff that they acknowledge that any threat's over now and that they're reducing the level of force that they're using.
So it's like a symbiotic kind of relationship. Once the heat is taken out of the moment, the staff then take the PPE off, and that gives a signal to the detained person that, you know, there's going to be some negotiation or give and take.
It's calming down, it's de-escalating. The other part to remember as well is the impression of other detained persons or other people in the establishment. So if they see somebody being moved with staff in full PPE, they might think it's something, you know, regard it a lot more serious than maybe if it's just someone being restrained as they would do normally. And I think it can sometimes quell any, concerns of the rest of the population.
And that's the theory. What about in practice in terms of what you've seen in Brook House, the 43 incidents? Were there any incidents where you saw staff de-escalating the incident by taking PPE off?
No. I saw one incident where a member of staff complained about being hot, and at the time he had a balaclava on, which he shouldn't have been wearing. They took the helmet off, took the balaclava off, and then put the helmet back on, which was mind-blowing, to be honest with you, that people thought that was acceptable.
That was Derek Murphy, that incident. Yes. And why was a balaclava? Is a balaclava an acceptable?
It's not authorised PPE for local planned interventions.
And do you know how or why a DCO would be in possession of a balaclava in a?
I can only think if he was trained to advanced level, whereby he'd be part of the mutual aid team within the establishment, he would have it for his equipment for that, but that shouldn't be used for local interventions.
You said it was mind-blowing to see. Why was that?
Well, once he'd taken the helmet off, why not just leave it off? Because there was no threat, there was no risk. The person being restrained was under control. And for me, that was a good prompt to take everyone to remove the helmets.
You said in your conclusion about this topic, about removal of PPE and de-escalation, in your first report, paragraph 650, that once the risk has been reduced, there's little evidence of PPE being removed, what you've just said. And you particularly focus on incidents 134 and 86, although you mention other incidents as well. We'll discuss later use of force against those individuals in the topic of offering no threat. But that you are of the opinion that at times when were times when PPE could have been removed to aid de-escalation, and when the initial risk to staff had been mitigated by control of the detained person. As an absolute minimum, the helmet and gloves could be removed when moving through the centre. In terms of your recommendation, is recommendation 6, which relates to this particular issue. Your heading there is training scenarios, and you said that there should be scenario-based training to include in planned use of force incidents where it is not appropriate to wear PPE or where it can be removed as a de-escalation technique. We've talked about taking off PPE during an incident. When would it be appropriate or not appropriate to wear PPE in planned incidents in the planning process?
Once you've done it, the supervising officer or the person in charge of the intervention had observed the detainee, the security intelligence. They would look at that. Could also look at health issues or anything else from there if there's any medical issues, and also assess the scene when they do their initial view into the room, because they would engage prior to deploying staff and to really get an understanding of the situation at that time. And if they felt that there was a risk to staff, then yes, PPE should be the consideration. However, if there was no need for PPE, then that shouldn't be used. But my greater concern is incidents that are unplanned, and there's that perception then that even if though there's still 3 staff there, that it's not planned. Well, it is a planned incident. If you've got time to actually, after the initial incident's taken place, and there's time to assess what's going on, then it is a planned incident.
We'll come on to that when we discuss D687
Sorry, yeah.
Incident. You've been able to review also, haven't you, the witness statement of Mr. Hewer from Serco, who is now head of Gatwick IRCs. He hasn't provided us with the details of the use of force training modules, so it's not clear that that's included in terms of PPE, but I assume you think you ought to be in terms of the initial training course.
Yes. Sorry, yes.
I want to move on now to the 5th topic, which is use of force not used as a last resort. We've already touched upon that with D2416, which was the one of the videos that we've seen. Firstly, looking at your findings, your conclusions in relation to this, it's in your first report, INQ 000111, paragraph 636, pages 145 to 146. You say you have a concern over the level of training and understanding, primarily at DCM level, of the lawful application of force, how to de-escalate, and exploring all other reasonable options before using force as a last resort. For example, a de-escalation technique could be used, such as removal of PPE during incidents 134, 81, 162, 86 and 108, or leaving time to allow the detained person to reflect using another detained person or suitable non-uniformed person to engage with and help to explain the situation, and to continue along with persuasion before forcibly removing a detained person. Out of the 43 clips that you saw, did you see any occasions where the detained person was left to reflect, or another detained person was helped to engage with the situation?
No.
And would you have expected to in those 43 incidents?
I think if you're evidencing that you make all reasonable efforts, sometimes that can help. Certainly based on my own experience, that's something that would regularly happen, is that you'd find someone maybe who had a good rapport with the person, somebody that they could confide in, someone that they trusted, that they could actually use them if they were available to help as a resolution to the situation.
I want to now go on to my first example, which is incident 13317 involving D1978. This was on the 26th of May of 2017, where force was used on the detained person after apparently refusing to go to CSU. I'm going to play now 2 clips in closed session. Just before we do, just to explain, the first clip is going to be the incident itself, and we'll just play the first 2 minutes, and that's from body-worn footage, and the second is the debrief afterwards, and we'll just play the first minute there, but I'll play them together. Thank you. you just keep in mind that debrief when we talk later at the end about the quality of debriefs. You've said in your first report, page 93, paragraph 384, that the footage from the debrief provides a different version of events when described by DCM Dix as compared to what actually happened. During the debrief, he states that D1978 started to encroach towards him and he had no option but to deploy the team. The scene footage clearly shows DCM Dix stand aside to allow 1978 to leave the room and then the team move in and restrain D1978. DCM Dix makes a half-hearted attempt to stop staff, but only after the first DCO has entered the room. The DCM Dix utters quietly to himself, "No, no, no." Should DCM Dix have been more assertive when trying to negotiate that surrender?
Yeah, he should have controlled that scene far better. And by that, what I mean by that, is that he should have stayed at the door. He could have given clear instructions, as he was, and he was getting compliance at that stage. It was quite clear that the detained person was walking towards him. Once he got to the threshold of the door, he could have stopped him and then told him to step out and done it all in a controlled manner. And I think the fact that, what was said on the debrief, as you say, doesn't reflect anything that was actually seen from the footage.
You say paragraph 398, this is your conclusion on that event, in terms of the last resort, that there was some confusion as to if D978 was actually complying whilst walking out of his room, and that a DCM Dix mismanaged the situation. In terms of whether it's necessary, reasonable, or proportionate, you find at paragraph 399 that it wasn't necessary to use force, and that he appeared to be complying. You also say that it was poor scene control, which is what you've already said. We heard from DCM Dix, and he gave live evidence to us on this particular point. His evidence is INQ 000167, pages 18 to 19. He agreed that by saying no, 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 he was trying to stop the officers going in. And because he agreed that the detained person was actually complying.
Yep.
He agreed that there was poor scene control by him, but stated that he didn't get any extra training. He said that he was confused in the debrief and it had slipped his mind that he had told officers not to go in. He said he needed extra training on how to be a supervisor and that he wouldn't have happened if there had been a proper review of the situation. Do you have any comment to make on that evidence?
Well, I've stated already that there should be training for DCMs before they take up post. I think considering DCM Dix had been involved in quite a few incidents that I reviewed, and I'm going to assume that he supervised many other incidents in the period since he was promoted. I think what was there probably wouldn't require any additional training. That's something that would be covered in basic training for all grades of officers. So I don't think that these failings there were anything to do with not having specific training as a DCM, because that was basic training that everybody receives.
What about him saying that it slipped his mind that he had in fact tried to stop officers going in and that he'd said no, no, no?
I can't even think why he would think that, because it was a short space of time afterwards. It wasn't a particularly long incident. So I think the debrief should be more about reflecting from the staff as well. So get their perceptions of it. What should have been brought out there is the fact that the staff should have explained why they thought they were being ushered in, so to speak, or why he stood aside to allow the staff to go in and restrain the detainee.
Because saying no, no, no to officers because a detained person is complying is very different to then explaining in a debrief that he was encroaching on officers and he had no choice.
But he was asking him to encroach because he asked him to walk to the door.
Encroaching perhaps not being a
but
correct
it
word.
amounts to the same thing, really, doesn't it? He's coming in, he's doing what he was told, and so it's very hard. And the no, no, no was once the staff had already gone past him, and that's what I meant by the scene control. He should have controlled that door far better.
Do you have any concerns about what DCM Dix, how he conducted that debrief?
Well, unfortunately was a reflection of many of the debriefs that I observed. Most of it centred around just asking the staff if they had any injuries. There was nothing in there about any lessons learned, if there was anything anyone felt could have been done better. Was there any issues anywhere? So I think that was probably the standard that was in place at the time.
But in terms of, not just in terms of the quality of the debrief, but concentrating on the fact that DCM Dix had said that he was encroaching and there was no choice in the debrief, when in fact what happened, and we saw in the footage, that he was saying, no, don't come in, because he was complying. That wasn't the truth, was it, what he said in the
No,
debrief?
and it would bring into question his integrity, yes.
And it might be an obvious question, but why is it important to tell the truth in a debrief?
Well, even more important when there's video footage available, because and sorry if I'm going back on old areas that I've covered,
No, please do.
but if there had been a proper procedure for reviewing incidents, that's something that would be picked up. So a proper panel would have looked and seen the debrief and the actual events are not aligned. They don't reflect one another. So therefore, that's what I say about bringing integrity into place. And that's why the benefits of having a proper system in place.
Does it concern you as to what it might mean for the reliability of other DCM, other debriefs that are given?
Yeah, it could do, yes, definitely.
I want to move to a second example involving D687, and it's incident 120/17. In your first report, paragraphs 214 to 216, you summarise the incident as follows. The detained person was due to be transferred from the centre, and task or staff were ready and waiting for him. The detained person was found in the toilet area of a holding room with a ligature around his neck, tied to a fixture within the room. He threatened to harm himself. Duty Director Dan Horton engaged with the detained person. I should say at paragraph 220, you say only for 11 minutes did that engagement take place. Seeing that the detained person had a cigarette, excuse me, he offers to light a cigarette and uses the ploy to move closer and to initiate restraint. After a short struggle, staff gain control and handcuff the detained person, who is then moved in preparation for the escort. Duty Director Horton states that he was in possession of a fish knife, therefore it's clear he had every intention of intervening and had the option of cutting the ligature. You considered CCTV and undercover footage because there was no body-worn footage, was there?
No, there wasn't, no.
You say that the incident should have been considered, this is in your report at paragraph 231, as a planned incident. Could you explain what's the difference between unplanned and planned incident and why it should be considered as a planned one in this instance?
So in this instance, why it was a planned incident is that there was no immediate risk. Yes, I accept that the detained person had a ligature, but at the time he was threatening self-harm. He wasn't actually carrying it out.
Just sorry to interrupt, just to pause there. You say it is a planned incident. You mean that essentially, in all but name, it was a planned incident, but it hadn't in fact been planned, whereas it ought to have been. Is that what you mean?
Yes, because there was sufficient staff there. There was no immediate need to use force immediately. So it's not like, say, for instance, a fight whereby staff would have to intervene straight away, wouldn't have time to plan. So this is something where they had ample time for somebody to start planning how to resolve the incident, which should have been through persuasion and negotiation. And because of that, it was a planned incident. Somebody should have bought some handheld device or a body cam. Healthcare should have been in attendance, and it should have been managed by at least a DCM grade.
And you said in your first report, paragraph 238, when concluding about this incident, that force was not used as a last resort, and that staff were engaging with D687, and it appeared that once DD Horton arrived, he was intent on resolving the situation by any means possible, evidenced by him taking a colleague's fish knife and using a diversionary tactic to cut the noose. Said staff appeared surprised by his actions, which led me to assume that there was no warning of his intentions. Negotiation and persuasion should have continued, especially as the incident was was contained and not affecting the regime. You've also said, paragraph 239, that it was not necessary, reasonable or proportionate. It said once the decision to end the incident was made, the force used was proportionate in the main, except for the leg restraint. When you say once the decision to end the incident was made, what do you mean by that? Which incident? Which part of the incident?
I think the actions of the deputy director for actually cutting the noose, and then the staff then decided that force was needed. And again, that's another classic one of the incident not being well managed, because there was nobody given instructions. I think I wrote in my report that the staff seemed caught by surprise at the actions of to remove the noose, and I'm of the opinion that they reacted because they assumed then that force would be needed, and that's where the lack of direction came from the supervisor by the managers present.
So there were two parts of the force in this incident, wasn't there? That there was the force that was used in terms of the ligature issue.
Yeah, that wasn't force, that was removal of the ligature, and then the force followed almost immediately by the evidence that I was presented with.
And it was the actions of Duty Director Horton which you've criticised.
Yes.
You said that the means used to initiate force do not, in my opinion, represent the professional standards expected of staff, let alone a senior manager. That's at paragraph 242. In your overall conclusions on that incident, paragraph 666 of your first report, you state that the incident did not require force to be used when it was initiated. Does that mean that it was unnecessary then?
Yes.
This is an example of crisis management and does not build effective relationships with detainees when they're experiencing frustration towards the immigration system. When you say crisis management, what did you mean by that?
The actions I felt of the deputy director was something that rather engaged with someone and trying to get a peaceful resolution. It almost seemed that he was intent on just turning up and ending the situation, because in all of my experience, I've never known a senior manager take somebody's fish knife, rescue knife off a colleague in order to carry out an action. And it's, for me, I just got the impression that he was intent on getting the incident done and dusted, for want of a better term.
So it's something that he says gave live evidence about and says something quite similar. His live evidence is at INQ 00174, page 93. Internal page 108 to 10111. He says that to have gone away and done a plan for use of force would have prolonged the incident by half an hour or 40 minutes. And he says, I quote, it was the best interest of everyone there to sort of bring that to a quick and safe resolution by securing the ligature, even where others didn't know what he was doing. Do you accept that a delay would have been caused if it had been a planned incident? No,
I don't. There was sufficient staff there at the time. There was no need for the staff to be taken away and given PPE. There was no threats to the staff by the detained person from the footage that I had available. Nobody indicated that he was offering any threat to anyone other than himself. So in that circumstance, there would have been no need for a delay. They had ample staff, they had ample resources at the time to carry out an intervention if they'd have been required, at the time. And
what advantage would there have been to have considered it a planned use of force?
As I said before, people would have been informed about what was going to happen. So if it had gone to the length where it's decided that actually force was the only thing left to resolve the incident, at least the staff would have had an idea of what to do, and they would have known what their role would have been, rather than just to react to something that unfolded in front of them.
So you agree that staff could have engaged with a detained person more and tried to persuade him to go with him rather than continuing with the force?
Yes, that should. I think the timelines I gave again aren't sufficient in my view. That certainly for somebody who's gone to the extreme length of tying a ligature and making the threats that were being made.
And in terms of the consequences of what would have happened had it been a planned use of force, that would have been that healthcare could have been present, there would, as you said, have been a clarity of the plan, and body-worn camera also could have been switched on.
For me, the biggest failing was also healthcare not being there. That for me is a massive failing in the fact that you've got somebody threatening an act of self-harm and you haven't got resources there to deal with it if that action had been carried out or potential action could have been carried out.
And it could have also mean, couldn't it, that force was not required at all if there'd been more engagement there, including healthcare, who could have assessed his mental health, and therefore the whole use of force might have been rendered unnecessary.
Could have all been avoidable, yes.
We heard live evidence from Chris Donnelly, so INQ 00014, page 3738, internal page 146, that he accepted that is one of his comments that we should we should wait a minute before cutting you down. Should not have been made. Do you accept that that isn't a way of engaging properly with a detained person?
Yeah, that's totally inappropriate, yes.
Also, it suggests, would you agree, that it means that force might not have been required at the time if you were saying, well, wait a minute for you to be cut down?
Yeah.
Planning also, of course, goes to the way in which force was used. We heard from Dan Horton in live evidence, INQ 000174, page 20, internal page 111, that he authorises the use of force, but he told the inquiry that he did not intend it. So planning could have meant that this would have been gone smoother and been better understood by others as to what was happening.
Can't see as he said he didn't intend it when he actually moved in and removed the ligature. So he had every intention of ending that situation.
And once the ligature is removed, was force required then?
There's nothing in any of the evidence to state that there was any level of resistance or any threat to the staff at that time, no.
In terms of pain-inducing techniques, I want to just take to your, I know to bring from the stream, but take to your first report, page 59. It's paragraph 228. You said the evidence available to the investigating officer and detainee for review consists of the covert camera operated by Mr. Tully and the CCTV footage from outside the room and the use of force statements from staff involved. The summary findings were that force was necessary, reasonable, proportionate to the circumstances. These are comments during interview by Duty Director Horton that he didn't resist too much, moving around, moving his arms away from officers, not extreme violence. DCO Martin states he was not a difficult man to restrain, he did not put up much of a fight. I note these comments and the overall summary as they contradict the necessity to apply leg control, as noted in my findings. Were handcuffs, was the use of handcuffs which were on before the inverted wrists hold, was that justified in your view?
I think that was a decision that would have been taken at the time, bearing in mind the risk due to the detainee being due to be removed. It could have been that the handcuffs were put on as a preventive measure in case they took out any other extreme action to avoid being removed from the centre.
And what about the inverted wrist hold being used after the detained person was in handcuffs?
No, there was nothing there. As a staff state in there, when questioned on the investigation, he wasn't difficult to restrain. They didn't encounter any major problems. So therefore, the inverted wrist hold in cuffs, as I said earlier today, was certainly something that would only be used in the most extreme circumstance and when there is an imminent risk to harm to either self or others.
Chair, I note the time, but I just want to finish this topic, so I'll just be a minute more, if that's okay.
Absolutely, thank you.
Can I just bring up, finally, on screen before the lunch break, TRN 00000007, and it's page 22. This is a transcript of of what we saw of the undercover filming. Looking at lines 24. See, D687 says, "Can you let go of my arm, please? I'm on the cuff. Let go of me, then in it. I'm cuffed in it. Stop fucking resting on my arm." On top of the second column. "Bruv, stop resting on my arm, bruv. You're breaking my fucking arm, bruv." Thank you. Those can be taken down. Are handcuffs required there at all, do you think?
As I say, I think that was a decision that had to be taken based on other risks for the removal. If there was no real risk, then possibly you could say handcuffs weren't applicable. But based on the potential risk, then that could be a consideration, yes.
And why is then the wrist hold required after that?
There doesn't appear to be any necessity for that. Once the handcuffs are on, as we saw earlier, handcuffs can be applied with no pain being used and the detained person being escorted in that manner.
And do you think there was a purpose to inflicting pain at that point? Was it a pain-inducing technique like we talked earlier?
There's no evidence to suggest, one, the protocols for applying the pain-inducing technique had been followed, or that there was any justification for it at that stage.
Finally, once in hospital in Dorset, D687 was found to have chest contusions, originally feared to be a rib fracture. DCM Farrell told the inquiry it seemed quite an easy restraint. That was INQ 00165, page 29, internal page 116. Does this affect your view of the proportionality of the force used?
Obviously, I'd need some sort of medical explanation about the potential cause of the injury. If there was an injury of that nature, it would normally be if there had been a prolonged struggle or a struggle in a difficult situation, or if staff had put undue pressure onto the torso of the person being restrained.
What about DCM Farrell's comments that it was quite an easy restraint? Does that affect your view of the proportionality?
It would
of the
do, because
incident?
if that's what staff encountered, and they were the ones there, they were the ones with the hands-on, so to speak, they're best placed to gauge the level of resistance and the level of threat to themselves and others at that stage.
You've concluded then in your report that that this is on your first report, paragraphs 82, 83, that based on the additional evidence that you've been provided, there are a number of incidents where the interaction between the DCM detainee was not sufficient and does not evidence that all reasonable efforts had been explored to gain compliance. And then you list the incidents 86, 88, 108, 129, 153, and we'll come on to those later on. Thank you, Chair. I think now is a good time to break. We have quite a lot to get through, so I wonder if we can ask for a 45-minute lunch.
I think that's fine. Okay. Thank you.
In which
So
case,
return at 10 to 2.
yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.